back and happy 2024. Welcome back to Can I Have Your Attention, Please? A weekly podcast with a 2-week break over Christmas, I might add, but a weekly podcast by me, Orla Holland, as a late diagnosed ADHD detected during the perimenopause, an adult female. I decided to start this podcast to help others. I know that there are hundreds of thousands of women out there with undiagnosed ADHD with no idea of what is about to hit. And many of the ADHD symptoms are very different to what we have grown up to believe. And I'm trying to raise the awareness around that because I know how difficult it can be for those of us who do hit perimenopause with undiagnosed ADHD and have no idea of what is going on. And it can have catastrophic effects on our lives. To start this podcast series to help others. That's what this is all about. So this week's episode, it being January, full of our New Year's resolutions, and I decided that this would be the right time to tackle the subject of ADHD and obesity, or struggles with weight. There is very, very real and very well-researched information out there around the very real links between ADHD and obesity. And I'm going to talk about all of that and share a lot of the resources. I will share links to all of the resources. I always try and use very trusted resources with regards to this, as I understand that there is a responsibility in terms of doing a podcast like this and getting the information out there. And I guess, as I mentioned, I was late diagnosed, so I was diagnosed at years of age. And what I'm hoping by sharing this, and I'm going to share, along with the facts, I'm going to share my own story. I'm also going to try my best to share some photographs over the years, so that I can, I guess, through that, I'm hoping that somebody else might listen to this and see themselves, because one of the facts that blew me away is that obese people are between 5 and 10 times more likely to have ADHD, according to a lot of research. So between 5 and 10 times more likely to have ADHD than the general population. I wish I knew that in the years that I struggled. For 30 years, I struggled with my weight. So I'm hoping that by listening to this podcast, somebody might recognize themselves and maybe get the help that they really do need, or just to help you to advocate for yourself, to get a diagnosis and get the help that you really, really need. And that could be utterly life-changing, as it was for me. Also, by the end of the podcast, I am going to share some of the things that I do that are very easy and very easy to implement. In fact, most of it was a mindset shift that could really genuinely help you. And it's something that you can implement from, this evening, as soon as you stop listening to this podcast. As always, I would ask you to share this with anybody you think it might help. There are so many people out there struggling with their weight and have struggled for years with their weight and may not be making the connection to ADHD. I'm not saying that everybody obviously struggling with their weight has a connection to ADHD, but perhaps you are one of those people, and this may really help. I can be accessed on Spotify, on Facebook, on Instagram, even on TikTok and YouTube. So any which way you like, you can share this. And again, as always, I would like to state I am not a healthcare professional. Any opinions expressed in this podcast are absolutely my own. But as I said, I always try to use trusted resources. I have done a huge amount of research with regards to this, but I'm only human. So, I can get it wrong. If I do get something terribly wrong and you spot it, please do get in touch with me directly and I'll rectify it immediately. So, that all out of the way, let's get started. Let's talk about the very real research and the very real links between ADHD and obesity. So I mentioned I'm going to attach all of the links that I refer to and some extra resources that you can read up about this yourself. I love doing that myself. I always do that too. So the links are always going to be there. But the very first thing I'm going to start with is an article from ADD or Attitude magazine. And I will put a link to this article. And within the link to the article, you'll see links to the actual research that was done. So it's a really good article. So medical research shows that obese individuals are 5 to 10 times more likely to have ADHD than the general population. So the link between ADHD and obesity is very real, though not yet fully understood. Certainly, impulsivity, poor planning, and high intensity emotions don't help in the battle to lose weight. But there could be more at play here. One trademark of ADHD is low levels of the neurotransmitter dopamine, a chemical released by nerve cells into the brain. Due to this lack of dopamine, people with ADHD are chemically wired to seek more. And this is from John Ratey. He's an MD and professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School in Boston. Eating carbohydrates triggers dopamine to the brain and dopamine to the brain, he says, and it's the drive for that feeling of satiety. So decades of research have shown a strong link between obesity and ADHD in children and in adults. And a 2019 trusted source suggests that about 70% of adults and 40% of children with ADHD are overweight or obese than those in the general population or those without ADHD. While it's unclear whether people with ADHD have obesity because of ADHD or vice versa, certain factors may contribute to both. A complex mix of genetics and behavior, such as eating habits, exercise, and sleep patterns, underlies the ADHD and higher BMI connection. So that's actually two different articles that I had pulled information from. And I like both of those because the links to the other articles are there, or the actual research are there. So like I said, I will put them, attach them to the show notes and under the episode. So what I'm now going to do is go through my own story. Because it is actually my own story that led me to doing this podcast. It is due to my struggles with weight that I actually got my ADHD diagnosis. So this topic and this podcast is very, very close to my heart. It's actually probably the first podcast that I've done out of the 8 so far that I've had to redo a number of times because it's difficult and I want to get it right. Because I genuinely believe that there are so many people out there struggling with their weight for years and that they're treating the wrong thing. Every diet, every exercise plan, it's never actually ever going to work. And it leads to stripping away of more and more of your confidence and belief in yourself and trust in yourself. And it's a really, really difficult road because you constantly feel like a failure. And I'm hoping that by listening to this podcast, some of you may recognize yourself. And it might just give you pause, just time to stop and think, actually, could that be me? Could that be what I'm going through? Is that what's actually happening? And I'm hoping by the end of the podcast that I will be leaving you with some tips and ideas of what you could do differently to just advocate. And maybe treat the right thing, and just change your approach. And it's such a simple thing to do. So let's get started. I am going to try and share my screen. If I can't do it, I'll let you know, and I'll post some of the pictures and images afterwards. It's acting up a little bit on me today. I was able to do it in the past, but I haven't been for the last couple of recordings that I tried to do. So really what they are is just going to be images of me in the background over the years. And it's funny, when it comes to this, there is no real, I suppose, before and after picture, as you'd see with the traditional weight loss, because that doesn't actually exist, in my life, if you like. It's always been a before and after, and then an after the after, and then maybe another potentially before, that might come, after, or with and after, if you like. Oh, here, that's starting to show now, so that should bring it up, and hopefully this will actually work. But anyway, I'm going to let these run in the background and just talk a little bit about how it kind of worked for me. So I always was on the slightly heavier side, but I wasn't an obese child. Now, this is back in the 70s, so there was very few obese children around in that time. I'm sure, had I been born in later decades, I would have been an obese child without a shadow of a doubt. We simply just didn't have as much sugar in the food that we were eating, and didn't have access to as many, carby, starchy, fatty, sugary foods. Where my weight issues really started was when I first gave up cigarettes at 19 or 20. Was I 20? Maybe I was 23. Anyway, around that time, when I first gave up cigarettes, I started to gain weight, and I really kind of struggled from then on. I went to my first Weight Watchers class around that time, and the usual, I would lose some weight and I would throw myself, hell for extra, with a few extra. When I started to get into the really obese and morbidly obese category was with my pregnancies. So you can see me here with my son. I have two children. They are now 16 and 13. I put on 5 stone in both pregnancies, despite trying absolutely everything not to. And I lost about 2.5 stone. I do remember that, in between my first and second pregnancy, through sheer doggedness. I'm spending an hour and a half in the gym 4 times a week, along with counting and weighing food. Anyway, some of these images you'll see, I took purposely to use as my before. And, I actually have some videos still that come up on my Google Photos and Google videos of me talking about, this is it. I'm going to absolutely change my life now. I mean, I tried everything because I felt so incredibly uncomfortable. And I knew that it was wrong. This wasn't how my body was supposed to feel. I was always very, very tired, and I always put it down to being overweight, despite the fact that I've had personal trainers, I've run a half marathon, I've run plenty of 10Ks. I would try and be very, very active, and I would try and manage my food, and I would try and restrict, the various different foods, but inevitably, eventually, every time, I would give in to the cravings. And the cravings were never for a head of lettuce. Nobody ever got a dopamine rush from a head of lettuce, unfortunately. It was always for sugary, carby, starchy foods. And the longer I would sort of stay away from them, then the more of the binge that followed. And I did, at one point, I had my name down through my doctor. My doctor was very supportive through all of this. Every time I would come to them saying there is something, it's just not quite right. There is something wrong. In fact, after my second child was born, I went on the list for a gastric, I think it was a band, actually. Maybe it was a sleeve, but it was, so that was 13 years ago or 12 years ago, for Loughlinstown in the public system. And I heard back from them about a year later, at which point I had lost 5.5 stone, which you can see in the last photo. And you can see me there. That's when I started to work with Slimming World. So I became a Slimming World consultant at the time. And I genuinely believe that a huge part of my decision to go into that industry was that I thought it would shame me into staying and keeping the weight off. I was so scared of regaining the weight because it always felt like it was something outside of my own control. So I thought that it was a lack of discipline, a lack of willpower. It was always my problem. I was just too weak. I just wasn't able to do it. Those cravings were unbelievably strong, and I remember talking to my husband about that Annie Lennox song, Constant Craving. I felt like it was like a running sort of backtrack, in my head, and I would be terrified of when those cravings would strike. So I started working with Slimming World first as a consultant. Then I got promoted to a team developer and then a district manager. And I stayed in that role in that industry for almost 10 years. And I went to many events as a district manager, but you can see from these photographs that my weight, having lost the 5.5 stone, it started to come back on. And in those 10 years, I, lost and gained countless stones. And I mean stones, not pounds, stones. I would gain 5, 6, 7 stone and then lose, 4, 5, 6 stone and then gain it back again. And in between that, there would be like gains and losses of 10 pounds here and there. But Gradually, as I got older, um, I noticed that it became more and more difficult to lose weight, which we often hear people talking about. And what actually ended up happening with me at that time was I felt that I lost my fight, you know, to, get back on plan, or, start a new regime of eating, or cutting out all carbs, whatever I thought was going to do it, you'd have that renewed sense of energy. And again, you can see the ADHD, the novel, I would throw myself into it, read everything about it, go to the supermarket, buy everything to do with that plan, and go hell for leather and be excited. When I was losing weight, I, get on track and I did a half marathon at the time, back into running, back into whatever it was going to be, and feel great, because actually I loved exercise and I always feel amazing. And the amount of times my poor mom was always like, "But you love exercise. Why aren't you doing it anymore?" And it was because exercise to me was always about weight loss. It was never about simply doing exercise for my head or for my brain. It was all, even though I would say, "Oh, it makes me feel much better, I'm much happier, it improves my mood," all of that was obvious. But I would never do it because of that, because my association with exercise was to lose weight. So gradually, as I got towards the 6 or 7 year mark, and I could see my weight was really, really piling on, I resigned out of the district manager role and went into the consultant role. And I genuinely believe that I thought having time on my side, or more time on my side, and was doing, less travel, that would help me to focus on my weight loss. And this was actually during the pandemic, and I went hell for leather at home, thinking, right now you've got the best possible opportunity to lose weight. You're at home, you're in control of all of your meals, you're not eating in hotels all the time, and you can do your own plan in terms of exercise. And I tried so hard, so hard. I threw absolutely everything at it. And yes, I think I lost a little bit of weight, but nothing that couldn't be undone in a week or two, which absolutely it was, with extra pounds. And I felt awful, absolutely awful. That was one of the worst ones, because I had thrown myself into it so much, and now all my excuses were stripped away because I was at home. I could not understand. I actually then went on and I studied, and I qualified as a nutrition. So after studying the nutrition qualification and realizing the answers weren't there, then the health and wellness, and realizing the answers weren't there, I was lost. I really felt at sea. I genuinely did. I did not know what to do. And the weight piled back on, and this time with a vengeance. It was always fast. I would always gain very, very quickly, but this was off the scale, and I was powerless to stop it. I had no fight left in me. I had nothing left to give. I could not stop it. The cravings were relentless. My energy levels were on the floor. And it was around that time I discovered I was perimenopausal. And I thought, aha, that's it. That's what this is all about. I just need to get myself sorted. So I had already been to my own doctor a few times, and the standard blood test was done, and it actually didn't show anything, because it depends on, you're fluctuating with perimenopause. So anyway, finally I did go to a specialist clinic, and I found them to be absolutely wonderful. And in fact, they had discovered I was more than likely perimenopause about 4 years into my perimenopause. And that made so much sense to me. So I started on HRT. It took a while to get the levels and stuff right, but that definitely improved a lot of my symptoms. A little bit more confidence in myself, and it gave me back, it helped with the brain fog to a certain extent, and it definitely helped my sleep, a lot of things. And I managed to get myself back on track and get a little bit more energy towards, managing myself and my weight. However, the very shortly after that, I think it was around then, with the spending. I noticed that every time I kind of took away food, now I know food as my dopamine. I didn't know that at the time. Something else would kick in. And it started to worry me because I was like, it was like an awful, horrible game of whack-a-mole, you know? You take away the food side of it, and it was the spending would kick in. When I took away the spending, as obviously that has a limited, limited funds available, alcohol would step up. And that was the one that really, truly terrified me. I've never had an alcohol addiction, but I don't know how to explain it in any other way except to say I always knew I was someone who could, given the right or wrong environment, I feel that that could be something that could take hold. So it did absolutely scare me. And I could not. I really, really struggled to lose weight. No matter how hard I tried, everything just felt like it was going against me. And I found it nigh on impossible, even with things I had tried before, they now weren't working. And again, with limited energy and limited feeling of, I suppose, control over it. And certainly at this point, after 3 decades of failing time and time and time again, I simply couldn't muster the enthusiasm to go and try and figure out another diet, something that was, totally different and going to work for me. And I guess I started hearing and reading so many stories, I'm sure like many of you, about people traveling abroad to have gastric surgery done. Now, I obviously heard all the bad stories too, but I will say that I felt utterly desperate. I felt utterly desperate. So I started doing the research. As it turns out, I was qualified or covered under my own health insurance here in Ireland to do it. So I managed to get my gastric surgery done in the Blackrock Clinic and under Dr. William Robb. So I had that done in April of 2022. I know I was very lucky to have that done, to have that covered on my health insurance. Absolutely feel incredibly privileged that that was, my story, that's how it worked out for me. At the same time, I will say, when I say lucky that I was covered under insurance, the reason I was covered is because my BMI was so high and I had co-morbidities. So, it's lucky in that sense. So I had my surgery in April of 2022. I left Slimming World at the time. Obviously, I could not continue to work as a Slimming World consultant, someone who had had, gastric bypass surgery. It didn't sit right with me. It didn't work for me. And I also wanted to get out of the weight loss industry altogether because my head was so caught up in all of that. So I moved jobs into a completely different industry and got a wonderful job that I work in to this day and really enjoy. And after my surgery, I decided actually just to go back on the surgery. I made the choice to have the bypass. So when I first met with Dr. William Robb or Mr. William Robb, he said, I qualified to either have the bypass or the sleeve. And the sleeve is less invasive and is still a massive impact on your life and your food choices for the rest of your life, obviously. But the bypass is the one that has a huge impact on your food choices and is more invasive and takes a little bit longer to recover from. And I chose the bypass because I was at such a point of not trusting myself. I remember having a discussion with a friend and saying, I have to go for the bypass because I don't have that control. That's just not in me. I simply cannot trust myself to make good choices. So if there is anywhere that I can slip in and have other choices, or make other choices around food, I'd be afraid that that's exactly what I would do. So I went for the bypass. Even though it comes with the risk of dumping, which is absolutely horrific and has happened to me since my bypass. Anyway, the operation was very successful and I recovered well. It's a huge operation. It takes a lot of recovery, and you can't drive and you can't actually lift anything, for anywhere between 6 and 12 weeks after the operation. Got through all of that, and the weight loss started really quickly started to lose, very large, 10 pounds in a week and things like that. And then obviously that slows down as time goes on, and you start off eating very sort of, it wasn't fully, it wasn't liquidized food actually with the surgery. Nowadays things are changing, but it was quite soft. And then you eventually go on to eating, thicker and thicker foods, but always, always following your plan with your dietitian. And with Blackrock Clinic came which actually was very, very good, an excellent follow-up plan. So I would go up and see them every couple of weeks, have all of my bloods completely done, and I made sure to follow the directions to the letter. And I'm sure that helped me massively, with my recovery. And with my, subsequent weight loss. So after I think it was about 7 or 8 months after my surgery, I had lost 6.5 stone, I think, at that time. All of a sudden, it felt to me anyway, the weight loss stopped. And that frightened the life out of me because I wasn't anywhere near where I wanted to get to. Not only did the weight loss stop, well, I suppose these two things go together, the cravings returned. And as I look back on it now, I had been spending quite a lot of money around that time because I justified it by saying, I need a whole new wardrobe. I'm losing all this weight. And I needed to stop doing that because I still had weight to lose and it wasn't the right thing to do. So the cravings came back, and I did a few times definitely have, some of the foods I would have had, like sour fizzy jellies and chocolate, things like that. And they made me, you can have a small amount of them, but this amount of them made me very, very ill. So after a few attempts at getting my dopamine from my, old pals, I had to stop that. And this is where the alcohol started to look, very tasty. And it was it's incredible because it's the same glass of wine, but it's how I felt about it was different. And that's what scared me, was how I felt about that glass of wine. It had such a hold over me in the same way as I would have said those foods had a hold over me for the years, the previous years when those cravings would come in that I simply couldn't, I couldn't fight them, was how I felt. So around this time, we had a very sad family occasion, and I had to put everything kind of on hold. And it was after we had lost a member of our family. One morning, I was sitting on the couch feeling absolutely dreadful and unsure what the hell was going on. Was it my grief? Was it my HRT? What the hell was it to do with, was I having some sort of, I don't know, like reaction to having had, massive bypass surgery? I couldn't figure it out. And I came across this article. This lady was telling her story, and it could have been me. The way she talked so similar to the story I've just told now, and it turned out to be ADHD. And honestly, the hairs stood up in the back of my neck. I was like, and I started to read more, and I started to do some research. And anyway, this eventually led to me getting my own ADHD diagnosis. And the day I got my diagnosis, the very day, actually sitting in this chair in this exact position, the negative voice stopped in my head. That had been a running commentary for I don't know how long. I don't remember when it started. I just remember it always being there. So I only knew it was there when it was gone, if you know what I mean. I was like, oh my God, all of these things, all of this shame, all of this guilt, all of this feelings about myself that I disliked so much, about choices that I made, things that I did, feeling weak, feeling never good enough. All of it started to make so much sense. And to this day, I still have moments where I go, oh my God, that's why. That explains why I felt that way or did that thing, or why that impacted me the way that it did. And especially when I attach that to food and I look at those cravings that I could never break, it was always me seeking dopamine and never getting it the healthiest way. When I look at, I can see how I was driven to leave jobs. I've had a huge number of jobs over the years. When I was going through my assessment with the psychiatrist, And I had to write them all out. I had to go through all of the, the years and the dates and the jobs. And there was 23 jobs in 19 years. And I just never had counted them before. I'd never thought about it before. It just had never entered my head. And I was lucky in that, for with Slimming World, I mean, I changed jobs in there 4 times in the 8 years that I was there. So it's still not like this big, long period of time. But they were an excellent company to work for. And I do want to mention that in terms of one, for the ADHD brain, they were great. They use a lot of coaching techniques in terms of how they manage their staff and how, the training, there's a huge amount of training. The job is so varied. And they are very big on giving, genuine and specific praise for jobs well done. And that really worked well for me and my ADHD brain. And it was so varied and interesting that that's what helped me to last there as long as I did. Also, they never once made me feel ashamed of my weight or my size. When I started with them, obviously I had the weight lost, and then it went back on, over the years. And never once did I ever feel under any pressure, which I think is a hugely positive, I suppose, culture within that organization. It was only ever support from that, from that side of things and in all sides of things. So I do want to point that out. Any of the shame and guilt that I felt was all my own. It's fine. I'm so full up to here with it, or I certainly was at the time, that I didn't need anybody else's. There wasn't room for anybody else's. So just to go back and point that out at the time. So at this point, when I got my diagnosis and that negative voice went away, and so did all that shame and that guilt, I guess the best way I could put it is, a switch sort of flipped in my brain, in that it went from, so my brain needs healthy levels of dopamine, and then it won't start searching out, all the unhealthy levels of dopamine. I know there's lots more involved than that, but if I just think about it as simply as that, even just doing that has made an enormous difference. So I did go on to lose almost 9 stone, which I am incredibly proud of. And I know would not have happened without me flipping that switch and getting the diagnosis and now starting to treat the right thing. Now, you'll know from my previous podcast, if you have listened to them, that I am medicated. I did decide to go down the route of medication, and it has been the best thing that I ever did, because that also helps to regulate my dopamine levels on a daily basis. And now I'm feeling like a completely different person, so much so that I'm doing this podcast. I'm actually here because I know that there are other people out there who could have this very, very positive experience as well, or go from being in such a really tough place to being in a much better place. So one of the best pieces of advice, and I mentioned it in a podcast, and I know I've done a few posts on it before, I got from a psychologist in Galway, was honor thy dopamine. And that really is exactly what I'm here to say. That instead of considering, a new diet or a new exercise regime, instead of doing anything based around weight loss or for weight loss, what about honoring your brain instead of honoring your body? So thinking about that would be planning. What I do is plan things in that are going to release dopamine naturally and in a healthy way for me on a daily basis. So everyone will be slightly different, but in general, the things that we as human beings enjoy are, outdoor activity, getting out into nature, being with animals if you possibly can, making sure that you're getting, good sleep. That makes an enormous difference. Exercise and movement is probably the number one way of releasing dopamine into your system. There are lots of things like cold water swimming or cold water therapy, even, cold water in the shower, even actually just getting it on your face. Ice water on your face can make a massive difference. But I'll let you go down those rabbit holes and look up various different things that you might like for yourself. I certainly had, for me, it was about finding ones that would fit into my daily life that I knew I could do. So walking my dog on the beach, I do it pretty much every day, but at least 5. I now go to gym classes because I love music. We go to gym classes 3 to 4 times a week, and I absolutely love them. And I've been doing them since May of last year without stopping. which is just unheard of for me. And again, it's all about doing it for the dopamine and the endorphins that are released. I will move. I suppose energy begets energy. So I now have more energy to do more things in the day. So I do move an awful lot more, and it makes a huge difference to how I feel. Planning to meet friends more often, going for cups of coffee, taking breaks, laughing, listening to music. There are so many natural ways to get your dopamine in. But unfortunately for us with ADHD, we can get into this hyper focus and spend hours and hours and hours, on one job and work without stopping to eat, without stopping to think, or without giving ourselves breaks. And it can become overwhelmed and extremely tired very, very quickly. So the first thing to go when that happens is those, healthy dopamine hits. And instead, your brain, it's chemically wired, as we said at the start of the podcast, it's chemically wired to seek out dopamine in its environment. So if we haven't given our brain that dopamine throughout the day, and let's face it, the neurotypical world that we live in doesn't really allow you to do this on a daily basis, not that easily anyway. So if we haven't done it, it's going to seek it some other way, which is exactly what happened to me over the last 3 decades with regards to, my weight, basically, with food and seeking dopamine from food. So one of the biggest things that I'm definitely going to do for 2024 is honor my dopamine. As often as I possibly can. I know I'm not going to be able to do it every single day, but every day that I can, I absolutely will. And I'm going to continue to find ways that make me feel good. And this is all about my brain. The body will follow. We honor our dopamine and flip that switch to looking after the brain. The rest will absolutely follow. And that's it. That's where I'm at. I hope this was useful and helpful to, and I hope somebody out there listening might see themselves and might think, oh my God, that's exactly what's been happening to me. When I look at the research, and the research is there to be had, we know that there are so few people with diagnosed ADHD. There are a lot, over, as I said, 250,000 people out there with undiagnosed ADHD. So, odds are that there will be somebody out there who listens to this and will recognize themselves. And maybe it is all about the weight. I focused so much on weight being my issue. I even went and worked in the industry for 10 years, that I would never have picked up on ADHD because it was always focused on my body. It was never focused on my brain. So I guess if you take one thing from this podcast, it's that, flip the switch, focus on the brain, the rest will absolutely follow. As always, I am available if anybody wants to get in touch at any time. I hope this will resonate with somebody out there and will help somebody out there. And thank you, as always, again, for listening. I'm often really surprised that people are actually listening or getting anything from it. So do get in touch and send messages. I love getting messages from people. So please do get in touch. And have a great week. And here's to a fantastic 2024. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.